How did Charles II die, and why was his end so painful? What barbaric treatments did his doctors inflict on him that we would now class as torture? Who supposedly robbed him on his deathbed? And did he make a secret and scandalous conversion to Catholicism just hours before he expired? Or is that just a legend? This is History Calling, and in today's Stuart Royal History documentary, I'm going to give you all the answers. Before I jump in, please remember that you can get even more from me, including early access to ad-free videos and bonus podcasts, by joining my Patreon site, which I've left linked below for you. If you enjoy this kind of content, please also consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel with the notification bell switched on. And if Patreon isn't your thing, you can join my YouTube membership instead for some extra perks and members-only community tab posts. Charles II was born on the 29th of May 1630, the son of Charles I and his French queen Henrietta Maria. Charles I was executed in 1649 after losing the civil wars in Britain, at which point the interregnum began, during most of which the British Isles were under at least the nominal control of the Lord Protector, Oliver Cromwell. Not recognising Cromwell's authority, the young Charles II dated his reign from the moment of his father's death, though the history books only record it as beginning when he was restored to the throne in 1660. He had tried to get it back before that, though, nearly dying in the process, and to learn more about the incredible adventure he had in 1651, when he spent weeks dodging Cromwell's men all across England, even hiding up a tree at one point and in several priest holes, see my video on those events, which I'll leave linked below for you. All you need to know about that episode for now, though, is that one of the men who helped to hide him from Cromwell and saved his life was a Catholic churchman named Father John Huddleston. Remember that name, for he'll be reappearing in our story shortly. Of course, we know that Charles did eventually get the throne back, and he reigned from 1660 until 1685. He married the Portuguese Catherine of Braganza, but the couple had no children, though Charles had a great number of them with his many mistresses. His heir, though, remained his brother, Prince James, Duke of York, who was a public Catholic by the time of Charles's death, though the king himself had always remained an Anglican, at least outwardly. That brings us to the last week of Charles's life. It was Sunday, the 1st of February, 1685, and the king was at Whitehall Palace. He had been feeling a little ill that day. He had a long-running problem with his leg and was unable to take his usual walk, but believed it was nothing to be concerned about, though he did ask that his doctors attend on him the following morning. In the meantime, that evening he went to the apartments of one of his mistresses, the Frenchwoman Louise, Duchess of Portsmouth. Diarist John Evelyn wrote in his memoirs of what the king, who was known as the Merry Monarch for his love of entertainments and his dissolute court, got up to that night, saying, "I can never forget the inexpressible luxury and profaneness, gaming and all dissoluteness, and, as it were, total forgetfulness of God, it being Sunday evening, which day se'nnight I was witness of, the king sitting and toying with his concubines, a French boy singing love songs in that glorious gallery, while 20 great courtiers and other dissolute persons were gaming at a large table, a bank of at least £2,000 in gold before them. 6 days after, all was in the dust." We have several excellent sources for what happened during those intervening days, including an account from one of Charles's doctors, a Dr. Scarborough, and a letter written by Anne Lady Mason, the wife of Sir Richard Mason, the second clerk comptroller of the household. Using them, we can weave together a narrative of Charles's final week. At 8 a.m. on Monday the 2nd of February, after a bad night's sleep, he got up as usual. He was pale and did not speak when his servant spoke to him, instead just blowing out his cheeks and making a puffing noise, something he often did when he was worried about something. The servants guessed immediately that something was amiss. When he did try to talk, he could only manage a few syllables, saying all when he tried to speak of Lord Allingham, though he also mumbled in French, a language he'd had to be proficient in given the decade he'd spent in exile on mainland Europe during the interregnum. The doctors and the Duke of York were alerted, during which time Charles went back into his closet alone. When his servants were eventually able to get him out, he looked even worse. Still, they sat him down, gave him some sherry and China orange to drink, and were just getting him ready for his morning shave when he suddenly let out what Lady Mason called the dreadfulest shriek was ever heard, and passed out. He was immediately bled of 18 ounces of blood, because back then bleeding someone was a popular cure for a whole host of ailments, the theory being that it balanced the four humours that the body was thought to be made from, i.e. blood, phlegm, black bile and yellow bile. This, however, was just the start of a torturous regime of so-called treatments that Charles would be subjected to. His hair was shorn off, and Lady Mason tells us that soon the doctors applied a warming pan of coals to his head and applied blisters to his back, arms and thighs. In the meantime, seeing him foam much at the mouth, they wished to vomit. He was therefore given a concoction of what we would call poison to make him ill, and duly spluttered up much phlegm off his stomach as a result. He was also bled of another 8 ounces in the following manner, as described by Scarborough. They prescribed 3 cupping glasses to be applied to his shoulders. These were designed to cause welts to draw out and so balance bad humours, to be quickly followed by scarification, i.e. making little cuts in the skin, deep enough to effect a fuller and more vigorous revulsion, and in this manner about 8 ounces of blood were withdrawn. There were now up to 10 doctors administering every horrible treatment they could think up to the helpless king, including enemas. Incredibly, despite all this abuse, he did actually improve for a while, regaining the power of speech after a couple of hours. He explained to his brother James and the others assembled that having felt terrible upon waking up, he'd gone to his closet to take some medicine, in inverted commas, because again, I guarantee you that whatever he took, we wouldn't call it medicine. The last thing he remembered after that was feeling very giddy. Despite being able to talk now, though, the doctors asked the king not to do so, fearing it would make him more ill. And Charles joked that he would obey, though he said that order would have killed Harry Killigrew, a clergyman well known to the king and a notorious chatterbox according to Antonia Fraser's biography of Charles, which I've linked below for you and which is also available via my Amazon storefront. Charles was now bedridden and continuing to be subjected to things designed to make him physically ill so as to rebalance his humours. There was also sneezing powder made of white hellebore roots and what Scarborough called a second powder made up of 4 ounces of cowslip flowers to strengthen his brain. There were laxatives too to, quote, keep his bowels active at night, according to the doctor, and an emulsion to counteract the scalding of his urine, likely to result from the use of blistering drugs, because dear forbid they just stopped blistering the poor guy and let him get some rest without sneezing or needing his chamber pot. Further enemas were applied, and cephalic plasters, meaning they were designed for the head, combined with spurge and burgundy pitch in equal parts, were applied to the soles of his feet. Lady Mason added that, "I should have told you, in his fit his feet were cold as ice, and were kept rubbing with hot cloths, which were difficult to get. Some say the Queen rubbed one and washed it in tears. Pillows were brought from the Duchess of Portsmouth's by Mrs. Roche. His Highness, the Duke of York, was first there. Then I think the Queen, he sent for her. The Duchess of Portsmouth swooned in the chamber and was carried out for air. Nellie, meaning another of Charles's mistresses, the actress Nell Gwynn, roared to a disturbance and was led out and lay roaring behind the door. The Duchess wept and returned. The princess, meaning Charles's niece, the future Queen Anne, who was pregnant at the time, was not admitted. He was so ghastly a sight, his eyeballs turned that none of the blacks were seen, and his mouth drawn up to one eye, so they feared it might affect the child she goes with. None came in the common door, but by an odd side door to prevent a crowd, but enough at convenient times to satisfy all. The grief of the Duchess of Portsmouth did not hinder packing and sending many strong boxes to the French ambassadors. Basically, it was pandemonium, and this was all still on the 2nd of February. Charles's miserable death was only just getting going. The following day, Tuesday the 3rd of February, the round of torturous treatments continued. With more medicines come poisons, which made Charles more ill and much weaker. When he was exhausted and clearly needed sleep, the doctors instead prescribed stimulants. At noon, they opened both of his jugular veins and drained another 10 ounces of blood from him, which would only have added to his exhaustion and feebleness. They were continuing to deliberately cause blisters, which led to continuing scalding urine and more laxatives. In fact, Charles was being fed so little that was really good for him and robbed of the nutritional value of what he was getting by being made to expel it out one end or the other, that combined with the injuries being heaped on him and the lack of sleep, we really do have to wonder if he might have recovered if he'd just been put to bed, allowed to rest and fed properly. On Wednesday the 4th, as the horrendous doctoring continued, Charles seemed to rally a little in the morning, before more convulsions in the afternoon. He was also apparently being robbed by someone who he trusted implicitly, at least according to Lady Mason. She tells us that she heard the following eyebrow-raising tale from James II, though it does not appear in other accounts. Supposedly, the Duchess of Portsmouth came and went of the inside of the bed, and sat down on it, and taking the king's hand in hers, felt his 2 great diamond rings, and, thinking herself alone, asked him what he did with them on, and said she would take them off, and did it at the same time, and looking up, saw the Duke on the other side, steadfastly looking on her, at which she blushed much, and held them towards him, and said, "Here, sir, will you take them?" "No, madam," said he, "they are as safe in your hands as mine. I will not touch them till I see how things will go." But since the king's death, she has forgot to restore them. Charles's convulsions continued, and he also suffered cold sweats and shivering. Hardly surprising given the blood loss and poisoning, never mind what the initial complaint was. The doctors weren't even competent at performing the treatments they were prescribing. Lady Mason remembered that one bleeding was botched because the doctor, named James Pearce, missed the jugular vein at first, only adding to the king's pain and misery. Thursday the 5th of February brought more of the same, including a delightful concoction called Spirit of Human Skull, which was administered multiple times. I found an explanation of what this was, and it's as disturbing as it sounds. According to a short 2018 article on the website of Oxford University's Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine, details below, this concoction was used to treat convulsions and was, according to Pliny the Younger, water drawn from a spring in the night and drunk from the skull of a man who had been slain and whose body remained unburnt. Lovely! Rather unsurprisingly, given that injuring him and pouring stuff like this down his throat was the height of medical treatments at the time, the king was now fading fast. He knew it too, and that night he did something extraordinary. He converted to Catholicism. There have long been suspicions that Charles was a secret Catholic well before this, and his family certainly seem to have known where his true sentiments lay, for his wife Catherine, sister-in-law Mary of Modena, and brother James were all talking about how to help him convert as early as Monday morning. But as Fraser points out, the lengths they went to facilitate a deathbed conversion for him, and the comments he himself made at that time, which we'll come to shortly, suggest that no such official conversion had taken place beforehand. The problem with helping him to change religions at this point was that Charles was absolutely surrounded by people, including up to 5 Anglican bishops, which, by the way, makes the story about the Duchess of Portsmouth stealing his rings because she thought them alone sound rather dubious, and in the anti-Catholic hotbed that was England at the time, there were few present who were going to want the king to abandon the church of which he was the head, it would be a PR disaster. Catherine, James and Mary were all Catholic, but their priests were only supposed to minister to them, and they were well known at court and in any case didn't speak English, though Charles's Italian was passable. It was not going to be possible to sneak one of them in to help. Still, when James asked his brother if he wished a Catholic priest brought to him, and Charles, who still had his mental faculties by the way, said yes, his brother found a way to grant this last wish. The Portuguese and Italian royal priests couldn't be brought in, but in the decades since his escape from Cromwell's men, Charles had not forgotten those who had helped him, and Father Huddleston had gained a place in the households of Queen Henrietta Maria and then her daughter-in-law Queen Catherine. As a result, he was in the palace visiting the Queen and willing to help. Disguised in a wig and cassock, he was smuggled into Charles's room, which James was able to nearly clear of spectators, save only the Protestant Earls of Bath and Faversham, who James wanted to keep as witnesses to the fact that Charles's conversion was real, voluntary, and done when he was in his right mind. Lady Mason noted this event, though she didn't know what happened in the relative privacy of the royal bedchamber, saying only that in his final days Charles wouldn't receive Holy Communion in the Anglican faith, but, quote, "I have heard he was once private, with only 3 in the room, except someone waited privately in another hard by till that vacancy. What passed then none can tell that will." Her information was a little off. There were 4 people in the room with Charles, but otherwise accurate enough if limited. Churchman and historian Gilbert Burnet later wrote that when Huddleston appeared in the room, Charles was delighted, exclaiming that he who had once saved his body was now come to save his soul. Huddleston himself later dictated his recollections of the extraordinary 45 minutes or so he spent with the king that evening, giving us a very good primary source to guide us, even if it was recalled sometime later. Huddleston said this: "Upon Thursday the 5th of February 1685, between 7 and 8 o'clock in the evening, I was sent for in haste to the Queen's back stairs at Whitehall, and desired to bring with me all things necessary for a dying person. Accordingly I came, and was ordered not to stir from thence till further notice. Being thus obliged to wait, and not having had time to bring along with me the most holy sacrament of the altar, I was in some anxiety how to procure it. In this conjuncture, the divine providence so disposing, Father Bento de Lemos, a Portuguese, came thither, and understanding the circumstance I was in, readily proffered himself to go to St. James's and bring the most holy sacrament along with him. Soon after his departure, I was called into the king's bedchamber, where, approaching to the bedside and kneeling down, I in brief presented his majesty with what service I could perform for God's honour and the happiness of his soul at this last moment on which eternity depends. The king then declared himself that he desired to die in the faith and communion of the Holy Roman Catholic Church, that he was most heartily sorry for all the sins of his life past, and particularly for that he had deferred his reconciliation so long. This comment alone proves that no earlier secret conversion had taken place. That through the merits of Christ's passion he hoped for salvation, that he was in charity with all the world, that with all his heart he pardoned his enemies and desired pardon of all those whom he had any ways offended, and that if it pleased God to spare him longer life, he would amend it, detesting all sin. Charles then made penance and confession and said an act of contrition. He was anointed with holy oil and received Mass, which had only just been smuggled in whilst Huddleston was with him. The priest read to him, quote, the usual prayers, termed the recommendation of the soul, and at Charles's request repeated the act of contrition. With all this done, the priest told the king that, now it rests only that you think upon the death and passion of our dear Saviour Jesus Christ, of which I present unto you this figure, showing him a crucifix. After a final prayer, Huddleston, quote, so recommending his majesty on my knees, with all the transport of devotion I was able, to the divine mercy and protection, I withdrew out of the chamber. After a lifetime of remaining an official Protestant in order to secure his throne and keep the peace in his country, Charles had at last, even if only in private, admitted to where his true beliefs lay. He had done so just in the nick of time. As Thursday turned to Friday, the king apologised to those around him for taking so long to die, saying at midnight that, "I shall depart." But he lingered on for some hours yet, enduring the ministrations of his doctors. His wife came to say her farewells, but had to be carried away as her grief overcame her. She sent back a message apologising if she had ever offended her husband, who commented, "Alas, poor woman, she beg my pardon, I beg hers with all my heart." He was right to do so, by the way. He'd been a pretty lousy husband. Bear in mind that he'd been canoodling with his multiple mistresses just days before, and Portsmouth and Nell had been at his bedside. In his final hours, many of his illegitimate children came in to say their goodbyes, though his oldest child, the Duke of Monmouth, born while Charles was in exile, was very much in his father's bad books, for reasons I'll not go into here, and when the king was listing off his children to the Duke of York and asking him to care for them, Monmouth's name was not mentioned. In fact, Monmouth, who liked to claim that Charles had actually married his long-dead mother, Lucy Walter, in secret, making him the legitimate heir to the throne, would go on to try to oust his uncle soon afterwards. I have a video about Lucy, which I'll leave linked, by the way. He failed in his attempt, and James II had him executed just a few months later in July. The mistresses were not forgotten either. "Be well to Portsmouth," said Charles, "and do not let poor Nellie starve." He said his goodbyes to his brother too, and James, said Lady Mason, behaved himself from the beginning to the end the best in the world. He wept bitterly and without affectation. He watched and kneeled by him till he could scarce rise or stand, and paid duty and respect to the very last moment. Scarborough agreed, saying that it was clear that James would rather have kept his brother with him than attain the throne, and was at times completely overwhelmed with grief. Mary of Modena was there too, crying in the background. The end was now very close. As dawn approached, the king asked that his curtains be drawn back so that he could see the sun rise one last time over the Thames. He was still compos mentis, asking that his clock be wound up at 8 a.m, as was usual on that day, but soon he was struggling to breathe, lost the power of speech, was bled again, fed more medicines, and fell into a coma. At around midday on the 6th of February 1685, he died as peaceable as a lamb, said Lady Mason. What was it, though, that had caused all of this? What was Charles's initial illness, and what did his autopsy show when it occurred? Doctors and historians in the centuries since have suggested a number of diagnoses for his original complaint. Those at the time blamed an apoplexy, a nebulous term which could mean different things, but which would seem to suggest a stroke in this case, though the lack of paralysis doesn't fit with that. Others have wondered if the death was caused by the effects of mercury poisoning over an extended period of time. Mercury was something used as a medication at this point, with no appreciation for the dangers it posed, while another theory points to chronic granular kidney disease. The truth is, we don't really know for sure what brought on the king's final decline, but the cuts, blisters, burns, welts, poisons, sleep deprivation, and semi-starvation that had been inflicted on him in his final 6 days could well have killed even a healthy individual. The body was left under a sheet until the next day, when it was opened up. Mason wrote that, "They say he looked then as in health, his blisters having made him raw, and the covering made him stink without, but his inwards were all good and sound, and might have lasted many years, though one little part of one side of his lungs was tainted or perished." Scarborough provided a much more detailed account of the autopsy, saying, "In the body of Charles II, most august King of the Britons, when opened after death, were found 1. On the surface of the brain, the veins and arteries were unduly full. 2. All the cerebral ventricles were filled with a kind of serous matter, and the substance of the brain itself was quite soaked with similar fluid. 3. On the right side, the lungs and pleura were firmly adherent to the chest wall, but on the left side they were quite free, as nature has ordained they should be in health. 4. No fault whatever could be found with the substance of the lungs, but they were charged with blood. 5. The heart was large and firm and quite free from malformation in every part. 6. In the depths of the belly there was nothing unnatural, except that the liver was inclined to be livid in colour, perhaps because of the abundance of blood in it, with which the kidneys and spleen were also engorged. Charles was given a quiet funeral, by royal standards at least, and buried in the Henry VII Chapel in Westminster Abbey, where he lies with the likes of his nephew and nieces, William III, Mary II and Queen Anne, with only a very modest little marker in the floor to denote the location of the vault. It's so modest, in fact, that I missed it the first time I was in that part of the chapel and had to ask one of the Abbey attendants where it was, then go back for this photo. In my defence, though, I was a bit distracted by the fact that Lady Margaret Beaufort and Mary Queen of Scots' massive tombs are right behind it. James II, as he became, would hold the throne for only 3 years before being deposed in favour of the same William and Mary. See my videos on how he lost the crown and on the story of the Jacobites to learn more about how the Stuart dynasty turned on itself and eventually died out. I'll leave them linked below for you. So that's the story of the painful death of Charles II and of how his own doctors basically tortured him for close to a week while his family looked on, all in pursuit of 17th century medicine. Before I go, if you'd like to get 2 free downloads I've created for you, all about how to recognise good history versus bad and interview your family members about your family tree, sign up to my free mailing list on my website historycallingofficial.com. And if you have Irish ancestry specifically, you might like to buy my book, Find Your Irish Ancestors Online, available from Amazon as both an ebook and a paperback. All the links you'll need for both are below for you. Let me know in the comments if you think Charles might have survived if only he'd been allowed to rest and eat normally. And if you'd like to learn more about this king, the story of the Stuarts in general, or the feelings of early modern medicine, try one of these videos next. Until next time all, keep learning.